In this film, we will present 5 crimes which Israel has committed. We'll show the scheme which the Israeli army used to commit these crimes, and how the Israeli government refutes and ignores the evidence, manipulates it, and even falsifies it. In this film, we used information made public by Israel, large news agencies, the Israeli media, and large aid organizations. The conflict over the Gaza Strip has a long history. Its current phase began in the middle of the 20th century with the establishment of the State of Israel. The war between Israel and Arab states saw refugees driven from the Gaza Strip. The region was controlled by Egypt until 1967, but Israel captured it in the Six-Day War. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip, evacuating the civilian settlers. Hamas wins the election and the subsequent internal conflict to take full power in the Gaza Strip. It portrayed itself as a group fighting not only in the Gaza Strip, but in the name of the entire Palestinian cause. When Hamas took power, Israel launched a blockade and carried out several large-scale military operations. In 2008-2009, Operation Cast Lead, in 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense, and in 2014, Operation Protective Edge. And Israel launched its most severe operation after Hamas's bloody attack on October 7, 2023. It is not possible at present to determine precisely how many people have died, but the estimates are huge. The Palestinians are facing hunger, the lack of aid, and violence, being held collectively responsible for Hamas's actions. Although officially the operation of the Israel Defense Forces is targeted against Hamas, their actions often contradict this.
Good afternoon. It's a very good afternoon, because at long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas.
On January 19th, a ceasefire brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States came into effect. It was aimed at ending the 15-month conflict which had begun following Hamas's attack. But this ceasefire proved to be temporary.
As we know, on the 18th of March, Israel broke the ceasefire.
The renewal of military action against Hamas.
From the 18th of March, Israel conducts intense military activity, bombardment, land operations on a limited scale, and so on. And this activity included the town of Rafah and, in fact, the whole of southern Gaza.
March 23rd. Rafah is attacked again. Among the many emergency services helping the local communities was an ambulance of the Red Crescent. The Rafah paramedic massacre.
Not far from the road they were driving along was a group of Israeli soldiers who couldn't be seen, who were preparing for a combat mission. The Palestinian ambulance was fired at. 2 of the 3 paramedics were killed, 1 was captured. When the Palestinian emergency services realized that there was no contact with their colleagues from the first ambulance, they sent another group of ambulances and also a fire truck to search for them. During the search for the first ambulance, these ones were also fired upon, and these people were killed. Finally, an UNRWA employee was also killed, meaning from the UN agency working in Gaza, who had nothing to do with the whole situation. He was simply driving down the same road and past the cars and people who had been shot, and he was shot too.
The location of the incident was blocked off by the Israeli army on March 27th, 4 days after the event. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs team arrives and finds the charred remains of the vehicles and the bodies of the paramedics in a mass grave. On March 30th, 1 week after the events, exhumations begin. This is how Israel explained what happened.
Our forces saw terrorists using ambulances as a vehicle to move around. They perceived a threat, and accordingly, we struck that ambulance. I must say that this is not the first and not the 100th time that Hamas operatives, including senior leaders, make illegal use of ambulances on the battlefield.
Potem okazało się, że w trakcie ekshumacji...
It later turned out that during the exhumation of the bodies which the Israeli army had buried in a mass grave, along with the crushed wrecks of the cars the Palestinians had been driving, during this exhumation they found a mobile phone by one of the bodies, which had been used to film the situation when that person from the second team was arriving. They had been driving to find their friends who they'd lost contact with, and he was using his private mobile phone to record the moment they were driving along that road. They're talking, wondering what happened to the first team.
Na tym nagraniu widać bardzo wyraźnie, że cała ta kolumna samochodów...
You can see very clearly in the recording that the group of vehicles have their emergency lights on, that they are emergency vehicles. They were all in work clothes, high-vis vests. They were clearly marked. The footage becomes particularly dramatic when the vehicles stop, when they see the first ambulance driven off the side of the road. The people get out of their vehicles, go up to the first ambulance, and then the shooting begins.
I w tym momencie zaczyna się ostrzał.
يا رب يكونوا بخير يا رب يكونوا بخير هي مرمين 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 بسرعة بسرعة حادث شيء
Możemy słyszeć strzały.
We can hear the shots and the fear in his voice.
Strach w jego głosie.
سامحيني يما سامحيني والله ما قبلت هذا الطريق إلا لساعد الناس.
Także on milknie w momencie, kiedy strzela.
And he stops talking when the shots get closer. The vehicle he's hiding in is targeted.
W którym on jest schowany. Po ujawnieniu tego nagrania,
When this footage is revealed, the first version, about the suspicious nature of the vehicles, about the justifiable suspicions that these paramedics were Hamas fighters, it was very hard for Israel to maintain this, so they began to look for another explanation. Finally, they released a new communique to tell the world that, in fact, a mistake had been made, that the commanding officer in charge of the attack shouldn't have done what he did.
Nie powinien był tego zrobić.
This is an excerpt of the IDF's official press release.
First incident. The troops fired at a vehicle identified as a Hamas vehicle. Following this, the troops remained on high alert for further potential threats. Second incident. Approximately an hour later, the troops opened fire on suspects emerging from a fire truck and ambulances very close to the area in which the troops were operating. The deputy battalion commander assessed the vehicles as employed by Hamas forces. Due to poor night visibility, the deputy commander did not initially recognize the vehicles as ambulances. Only later, after approaching the vehicles and scanning them, was it discovered that these were indeed rescue teams. Third incident. About 15 minutes later, the troops fired at a Palestinian UN vehicle due to operational errors in breach of regulations. The commanding officer of the 14th Brigade will receive a reprimand, which will be recorded in his personal file for his overall responsibility for the incident, including the procedure of combat and management of the scene afterward. The deputy commander of the Golani Reconnaissance Battalion will be dismissed from his position due to his responsibilities as the field commander in this incident and for providing an incomplete and inaccurate report during the debrief.
A reprimand and dismissal for the murder of 15 people.
No, ale jednak mimo wszystko stwierdzono, że przynajmniej...
But in spite of everything, they stated that at least some of those killed were Hamas members. This information cannot be confirmed in any way, but from unofficial sources, we know it's likely to be false. The autopsy of the bodies exhumed from the mass grave shows the majority of them were shot in the head or in the chest, so clearly in order to kill them.
Strzelano do nich tak, żeby ich zabić.
But not all the paramedics died. Munther Abed, a 27-year-old Red Crescent volunteer, was the only survivor. He was arrested. Later, he would speak about what happened to him. This is an excerpt from The Guardian. He was beaten, detained with his hands tied, and made to lie on the ground, from where he was able to see some of what happened as other friends and colleagues arrived on the scene in ambulances and fire trucks, each one running into a hail of gunfire. Their bodies were found in a sandy pit where Abed watched the troops dig. Abed himself was held for several hours, sometimes in a hole dug in the ground, during which he was fully stripped, beaten again, and interrogated about his past. He was later forced to help in the vetting and photographing of local people who were ordered to leave the area. Abed was released in the evening. He was given back his watch and underwear, but not his identity card, paramedic uniform, or shoes. He was told to walk towards Al-Mawasi and was eventually able to flag down a passing Red Crescent vehicle. He said he was still in pain from the beatings and described his state of mind as shattered.
Od początku wojny w Gazie zginęło
Over 400 employees of humanitarian organizations have died in Gaza since the war started. They are mostly Palestinians, local workers of humanitarian organizations such as UNRWA. In fact, UNRWA alone has lost over 200 people. These people have died in different circumstances. Sometimes they just die like Palestinian civilians in their homes, which are attacked for one reason or another. They're where refugees are, and these are attacked by the Israeli army for one reason or another. But we do need to add that there have been multiple attacks on buildings linked to international organizations, irrespective of their status.
The attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy, December 2023, the second month of Israel's operation in the Gaza Strip. The UN warns.
The situation is very dire. It is catastrophic, the least we can say. We've seen people struggling to actually find food. We've seen people who are struggling to actually find the wood to light fire so that they can actually cook a meal. Definitely, if the situation continues like this, we know from our food security assessments that basically the situation is very bad.
The Gaza Strip was bombed by Israel. The border points were guarded by Israel. Getting aid to those in need was difficult. In order to alleviate the crisis, some countries chose to make food drops. Here we can see the French Air Force doing this. The International Court of Justice, upon South Africa's request, has issued several decisions to apply temporary measures against Israel. This is part of a case in which South Africa has accused Israel of breaching the Genocide Convention. March 28th, the International Court of Justice orders Israel to take measures. This is an excerpt of its statement.
In view of the worsening conditions of life faced by Palestinians in Gaza, in particular the spread of famine and starvation, Israel shall take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza.
Israel would respond that the claims and conclusions to launch new aid measures are, quote, fully unfounded in fact and law, morally repugnant, and represent an abuse both of the Genocide Convention and of the court itself. Despite the lack of security and cooperation with Israel, humanitarian organizations were doing their work, trying to deliver aid wherever it was needed. One of these was World Central Kitchen. On April 1, 2024, a World Central Kitchen convoy was heading south along Gaza's coast.
These
were 3 civilian vehicles with World Central Kitchen employees who were delivering humanitarian aid. They came under attack, in sequence, so it's clear it was not a mistake. First, one vehicle was attacked. The survivors got into another vehicle, but then this second one was attacked. The situation happened again. The survivors switched to a third vehicle, and then this one was also attacked. It all occurred over around 2.5 kilometers. There were 7 casualties. British citizens, an Australian citizen, a citizen of Canada and the US, a Polish citizen, and a Palestinian. Since this involved foreign citizens, it resounded internationally. The countries whose citizens had died demanded an explanation.
An independent body will investigate the incident thoroughly. We will complete it in the next coming days. We will learn from the conclusions and implement them immediately. We will share in full transparency the findings of the investigation with the World Central Kitchen and other international relevant organizations.
Israel explains that there had been cause to believe the convoy was carrying a Hamas fighter and that the vehicle's markings could not be seen by the drone operator.
These explanations were rejected by the countries whose citizens had died because it was known that the convoy's passage had been coordinated with the Israeli army. The army had been informed about the convoy ahead of time, about who would be in it, what route it would be taking. So this explanation that the vehicle markings signifying that they were part of a humanitarian aid convoy couldn't be seen by the drone operator, in this situation, it's clearly an unsatisfactory explanation.
And the airstrikes on our convoy, I don't think were an unfortunate mistake. It was really a direct attack on a clearly marked vehicles whose movements were known by everybody at the IDF. I've been in Gaza myself. I met, and some of the people that died were my friends, and I served with them. Somi is the nicest angel you will ever meet.
We are currently dealing with an extremely bad situation in terms of food. There is increasing information about death by starvation, about the very serious health problems of the Palestinian population due to the lack of food, due to famine and malnourishment. We need to say it openly. There is alarm, there are appeals, but to no effect. People are eating what they can find. The humanitarian organizations are distributing what's left of their supplies, and the situation is worsening daily.
Rafah. This is a map of the Gaza Strip on May 1st, 2024. We can see Israeli forces mainly operating in the north. In the south, at the start of May 2024, there were still no Israeli soldiers.
Rafah was at the time the part of Gaza where the refugees from the north were sheltering. In the city of Rafah alone, it's estimated that there were around 1.5 million people, so the vast majority of the pre-war population of the Gaza Strip. It was therefore known that every attack on this area would have catastrophic consequences for the situation of the civilian population, with large numbers of civilian casualties, and on the humanitarian situation. At the start of 2024, Israel, above all Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, started to discuss the need to launch a ground offensive in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. The idea that we will halt the war before achieving all of its goals is out of the question. We will enter Rafah, and we will eliminate the Hamas battalions there, with or without a deal, in order to achieve total victory.
May 6th. Israeli forces start the land operation in the south of the Gaza Strip. Intense air raids are carried out against the city. Later that day, Israeli divisions entered the outskirts of Rafah, approaching the border crossing with Egypt. The following day, the border was closed. It had been a crucial point for the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel claimed this was done to neutralize the tunnels used by Hamas, which led to Egypt.
This has been very controversial since the war started and has been criticized a lot worldwide, including in the United States. President Biden repeated many times that it's a bad idea. He went so far as to say that attacking Rafah would be a red line for America. But Israel persisted with the idea, insisting that the invasion of Rafah is crucial for the war's objectives, in part because Rafah, southern Gaza, is linked to Egypt by subterranean tunnels, which Hamas is smuggling people and weapons through, that it's a supply line for Hamas, and if Israel can't gain control of the territory, then it won't be able to achieve its war aims. Prime Minister Netanyahu very consistently repeated this. We need to note that at this time, ceasefire negotiations were underway between Israel and Hamas, with Egypt and Qatar as intermediaries, with support from the United States. And a couple of times it may have seemed like they were close to an agreement. Maybe not a final ceasefire, but at least a temporary one. A few times it seemed close, but whenever that was the case, Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that, in fact, the invasion of Rafah and taking control of the Philadelphia corridor, meaning that very border zone between Gaza and Egypt, that it's absolutely necessary for Israel's war effort.
The events linked to Israel's operation in Rafah and the IDF searching for tunnels were linked to a disinformation campaign aimed at justifying Benjamin Netanyahu's actions.
As criticism of Netanyahu increased, he stated publicly that one of Israel's reasons for needing to maintain permanent control of the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip was security. That Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, would escape Gaza that way and take some Israeli hostages with him and take them to Iran. And then Israel would never get them back. This meant Israel would simply have to control that territory. The next day, the 5th of September, there was an article in the Jewish Chronicle, the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world. It contained information that intelligence sources in Israel had confirmed this version that Yahya Sinwar could take Israeli hostages to Iran through this tunnel between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. The article initially caused a huge sensation. Netanyahu's wife shared it, and so did his son. It was cited as confirmation of the Prime Minister's theory about the existence of this threat. It ultimately turned out to be false and caused a very serious crisis for the newspaper, the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world. A few journalists, highly respected worldwide, left the paper in protest at the publication of unverified, unreliable, and finally untrue information. And so finally, this justification that the Israeli army had to enter Rafah turned out to be untrue.
The German paper Bild featured a similar manipulation. It published an article stating it had gained access to a highly classified Hamas document. The conclusions were clear. Hamas had no intention of ending the war, negotiating with terrorists is pointless, and the families of hostages and those protesting to demand an immediate agreement were serving the interest of Hamas. There was also information about Hamas's plan to take the hostages out of the Gaza Strip to Iran. The true version was revealed when journalists from Panorama saw the same document. It turned out that Bild had only selected facts that fit its narrative. They skipped information about Hamas aiming for a ceasefire, which could lead to an end of the war. Furthermore, there were doubts about how the document had leaked. The official version claimed an Israeli NCO had stolen the documents from a computer, passed them to Netanyahu's assistant, Eli Feldstein, who passed it on to the newspaper. In court, Feldstein claimed he'd acted on Netanyahu's orders. The prime minister obviously denied this. Did the Israeli army present any proof of the existence of the tunnels in Rafah? It did. But this also turned out not to be entirely true.
At the beginning of August, the Israeli army published this picture alleging to show one of the tunnels leading from Egypt to the Gaza Strip. A huge tunnel, big enough for a car to fit in it. And on the published picture, we can see an Israeli army vehicle driving out of the tunnel. The picture was authorized for publication by the Israeli army on the 4th of August 2024 and provided visual proof that these tunnels really exist and can really serve as a very serious supply route for Hamas, since they're big enough for a car to fit through.
At the time, this discovery was seen as something of huge importance. But it turned out not to be a Hamas tunnel, and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, a rival of Netanyahu's, spoke about it.
Shall I tell you something about this picture? I checked it. The public can't see that this tunnel isn't 20 to 30 meters underground. It's 1 meter. It's a highway tunnel. They covered it with dirt. Someone took a picture and it caused a sensation. Ultimately, there were no tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor.
I okazało się, że nawet tak sugestywny dowód.
And finally, such suggestive proof alleging to show a huge tunnel deep underground turned out to be a visual manipulation serving to justify the theory that a land invasion to Rafah and the permanent control of the territory was needed. The result was that some months later, in mid-September, the Israeli army itself admitted that, though there are indeed tunnels, they are not functioning. From the start, Egypt had rejected Israel's claim and stated that it was dealing with these tunnels itself, that it had control of them, that they're blocked up, non-functioning, that nothing can be smuggled that way. Israel had rejected Egypt's position. A few months later, though, the Israeli army itself would admit that there had been no functioning tunnels between Egypt and Gaza, that most of Hamas's weapons were produced in situ or smuggled in, but not via tunnels. So this meant that Prime Minister Netanyahu's main public justification for the need to invade Rafah had simply been untrue, even in light of what the Israeli army finally stated.
The destruction of the Turkish-Palestinian hospital in Gaza.
Turecko-palestyński szpital w Gazie, a właściwie, żeby użyć nazwy...
The Turkish-Palestinian hospital in Gaza, to give it its full official name, the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, was built from Turkish development assistance funds and opened its doors in 2017. It was on the grounds of one of Gaza's universities and was one of the most state-of-the-art hospitals in the Strip, well known for having the only oncology department. It was the only place specialized in providing care for cancer patients.
8 connected blocks, 4 operating rooms, intensive care units, laboratories, and 180 rooms in a combined, closed-off area of over 33 square kilometers. The hospital first stopped functioning due to a lack of fuel, and later Israel reported that it had been destroyed in an airstrike on March 21, 2025.
Uzasadnienie tego działania początkowo znów było takie,
This was again initially justified because, according to Israel, the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital was being used as a Hamas command center.
But Israel failed to mention that after the hospital stopped operating, but before it was completely destroyed, it was being used as a military base, not by Hamas, but by Israel. Many recordings prove this, and we'll come back to it later. March 21st, the destruction of the hospital. Israel reports there were no civilians in the hospital when it was attacked, and the whole operation was aimed at Hamas. Turkey published a statement condemning the destruction.
We strongly condemn Israel's destruction of the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which was built by Turkey and operated by local authorities as a cancer treatment facility. The deliberate targeting of a hospital providing healthcare services to civilians in Gaza constitutes part of Israel's policy aimed at rendering Gaza uninhabitable and forcibly displacing the Palestinian people. We call on the international community to take concrete and deterrent measures against Israel's unlawful attacks and systematic state terrorism.
Szybko jednak okazało się, że wyciekło...
It soon turned out that it had leaked online. Footage showed the moment the hospital was destroyed, not by an airstrike or perhaps artillery. In reality, it was blown up. Explosives were placed there and detonated in an entirely controlled manner at a time defined by the Israeli army.
Co raczej wyklucza możliwość, żeby jednocześnie na terenie tego...
This would seem to rule out the possibility that there had been Hamas fighters there, because this kind of operation needs access to the building. Israeli army explosives experts need to be in there for a long time. Then they need to detonate them at the defined chosen time in an absolutely controlled way.
Footage published a few days after the detonation proved that the Israelis had been in the hospital. It was most likely recorded between January 19th and March 18th, meaning during the ceasefire.
Graffiti destroyed equipment, writing in Hebrew. It clearly shows Israeli soldiers were there, and again here we have a change in Israel's official message. It turned out that there was an alleged unauthorized act from the commander who decided to blow up the building. He allegedly made the decision without consulting his superiors, and an investigation into it is underway. There's an obvious question. Why was it done? Why was the building blown up? There is absolutely no reason to believe that it was in any way being used by Hamas, or that it in any way posed a threat to the Israeli army. We can only speculate. I think that maybe it was because the building is very close to the so-called Netzarim corridor, meaning a corridor which the Israeli army broke through the Gaza Strip to the south of Gaza City. It splits the strip into smaller parts. The Israeli army is planning a few more of these corridors through Gaza, or has already made them, or is about to. And this makes it easier for the Israeli army to reach selected points without having to travel on the normal roads in the strip. The Netzarim corridor exists, but since it was broken through, it's been successively broadened, meaning increasing its size on both sides. The area is being consistently cleared of buildings so that the Israeli soldiers can see if there are any threats. As I said, it's a hypothesis. I have no proof of it. But given that the hospital was close to the corridor, I assume it was intentionally destroyed with premeditation, precisely in order to clear the surroundings and to widen the territory of the corridor. When it was destroyed, the hospital was not functioning. As I said, it hadn't been open since November 2023, but it still had some equipment. Yes, it was damaged due to the war, but to some level it could still be renovated and returned to its original function in the future. But now there are only the ruins of that building.
To nie jest tak, że tuneli nie ma w ogóle. Tunele istnieją, natomiast...
We can't say there are no tunnels. There are some. But Netanyahu's theory about the tunnels functioning between Gaza and Egypt, Hamas's supply tunnels, this turned out to be incorrect. But Hamas does have tunnels. It built them and used them to attack, to protect its fighters. This is true. No one doubts this network of tunnels is very well developed. Israel is telling the truth here. This is all true.
The Al-Shifa hospital siege. Al-Shifa was the largest medical facility in the Gaza Strip. It employed 1,000 people, doctors, nurses, technicians, and administrative staff. It served thousands of patients annually.
Stał się on przedmiotem, obiektem, celem działań militarnych już...
It was targeted in military actions right at the beginning of the war. It was besieged between the 11th and 24th of November 2023. The Israeli army claimed that there was a huge network of tunnels under the hospital being used as a Hamas control center. Even when it was preparing the siege and when it stormed the Al-Shifa hospital, the Israeli army published some extraordinarily suggestive films with an animation depicting precisely how these tunnels under the Al-Shifa hospital were being used as a Hamas command center. It was a highly suggestive image intended to convince global public opinion that the building needed to be attacked and taken.
Our operation at Shifa Hospital proves once again Hamas systematically uses hospitals to wage war and consistently uses the people of Gaza as human shields.
On November 11, 2023, Israeli armed forces surrounded the hospital. On November 15th, the Israel army reports it had entered the building. The Palestinian Authority reported that 400 Palestinians died in the attack. Footage of the Israeli soldiers entering the building is disturbing. We can't show everything in this film. Witnesses and organizations such as the WHO and Doctors Without Borders said that there was no water, electricity, medicine, or food. The medical staff was forced to hide, and many died or were imprisoned. According to the Palestinian Authority, the courtyard was turned into a mass grave.
Al-Shifa w dużej mierze przestał funkcjonować w czasie oblężenia, które, tak jak mówię, trwało...
Al-Shifa largely stopped working during the siege, which lasted around 2 weeks. Some of the patients there simply died because there was no fuel. That includes children, newborns in incubators. Some of them died. Dozens of patients in the intensive care unit died because the equipment needed to keep them alive didn't work due to a lack of fuel. When the building had been taken, it turned out that the evidence that it had really been used by Hamas was not so convincing. The Israeli army showed a few guns which they had allegedly found inside Al-Shifa hospital. It also published films with its officers, including the spokesperson of the Israeli army. And they allegedly went down into the tunnels beneath the hospital and showed this network of tunnels which had been the reason for the entire attack.
Compound, we're underneath the ground. We are approximately between in the Shifa hospital.
These are the alleged tunnels under the Al-Shifa hospital. Alleged because Israel's statements began to be doubted. Let's start with who built the tunnels. A former Prime Minister of Israel answers this question.
It's already known for many years that they have in the bunkers that originally was built by Israeli constructors underneath Shifa decades, many decades ago, probably 4 decades ago, that we helped them to build these bunkers in order to enable more space for the operation of the hospital within the very limited size of this compound.
Natomiast nie ma żadnych przekonujących dowodów, które pokazywały...
But there is no compelling evidence to show that the tunnels were being used by Hamas. In December 2023, the Washington Post published the findings of its journalistic investigation which strongly, though not definitively, disproved the Israeli army's theories. The investigation stated that the visual materials which the Israeli army had shown to allegedly prove that there had really been a command center under the hospital, that these materials were quite weak, a dozen or so weapons. Even if they were really found in the hospital, it wouldn't be grounds for such a huge attack. And the footage published of the hospital's underground from the tunnels in some rooms there, they still prove nothing in and of themselves.
It's hard to put a number on how many people died during Israel's siege. Some died during the military action, others because of failure of medical equipment. Oxygen ran out for intensive care patients. Incubators for premature babies stopped working. And according to Doctors Without Borders, at least one convoy sent to help evacuate patients was fired upon. Israel's method of operating for the majority of its crimes is similar. First, the reports come in of a convoy being fired on or a hospital being attacked. Israel denies it, stating the attack was against Hamas. Then we see proof that that wasn't the case, and that civilians or civilian infrastructure was targeted. The Israeli government then says it was an accident or unauthorized actions by commanders, and that there will be consequences. But these consequences are minor, if they happen at all.
The attitude to Israel and its leaders is now changing. There is a group of countries still willing to receive the Israeli Prime Minister. Recently we saw his visit to Hungary, for example. We can probably assume Germany would be a country which, despite what's happening, wishes to keep its contacts with Israel at a very high level. We recently saw Germany's new foreign minister travel to Jerusalem. The US is traditionally a very close ally of Israel, but I have the feeling that there's now a large group of countries which Netanyahu cannot freely and easily travel to without having to worry about legal issues or, for example, large protests about his visit. So I have the impression that what Israel is doing, the way it's waging this war, including by de facto starving the Gaza Strip, does in fact reflect on the country's international image and on Netanyahu's image. but we need to say openly that Israel is a country which has a very strong international position, which is supported by the US. We know about the US sanctions on the International Criminal Court, so the position of Israel itself and the US standing behind it means that this country isn't facing the categorical condemnation which would be warranted by what Israel is doing on the territory of the Gaza Strip.
Thank you for watching. If you found this film useful, why not try the ones you can see on screen now?